Hey everybody, it's PartyElite, and today we're taking a look at Total War Warhammer 3, the very hotly anticipated follow-up to the now nearly 5-year-old Total War Warhammer 2. This one's been cooking for a very long time, and we've been seeing hints from pre-production for many years now, so it's pretty exciting to finally have the release date upon us, and to finally see what it's all resulted in. A big thanks goes out to the folks over at Creative Assembly for providing me with a review key so that I could prepare this video for before launch. As always, that does nothing to impact my opinion here, and I think that'll be plenty obvious as we get further along this review. If you decide you'd like to grab the game and you want to support the channel while doing so, don't hesitate to use the link in the description or pinned comment down below to support the channel again as you buy. Now, with all that said, let's finally see if Total War Warhammer 3 lives up to the hype. Should we expect Slaaneshi Ecstasy or a gift from Nurgle? I'm going to save a lot of people a lot of time here to kick things off, but feel free to watch the whole video if you want an in-depth opinion, of course. If you're a die-hard fan of Total War Warhammer 1 or Total War Warhammer 2, and you've enjoyed all the DLC and all the options you had to play with in those two games, you'll enjoy Total War Warhammer 3, and I can wholeheartedly recommend it to you. The only reason you might not enjoy this game, despite having loved the first two and all their DLC, is if you don't care for the factions available at launch: Kislev, Cathay, the 4 Demons of Chaos factions, and Chaos Undivided. Personally, I think they're all very well fleshed out, mechanically compelling, and quite the audio-visual ride as well, but I understand some folks will have their tabletop loyalties or might just feel disinterested by the focus at launch here. Remember though that sometime in the nearish future, we'll be getting the equivalent of Mortal Empires, let's call it Immortal Empires for now, a mode that will blend the campaign map of all 3 games for owners of all 3 games, so that you can play as your favorite factions from the old games while enjoying the features and improvements in the new one. And there are quite a few of those, especially if you're interested primarily in multiplayer. The advantage of buying the game within the first week of release is, of course, getting the Ogre Kingdoms DLC included with your purchase for free rather than having to buy them separately. We'll talk more about the Ogre Kingdoms DLC separately, though I do want to point out that they don't come with Regiments of Renown, and with that said, to be clear, I say again, if you like the first 2 games and want more of the same trajectory, you'll almost certainly enjoy this third one. If you were feeling a little iffy, or you were starting to get a little tired by the end of Warhammer 2's life cycle, or maybe you were hoping for a game-changing experience, the next big step in Total War, that's where things get a little more mixed. Factions and their units. Total War Warhammer 3 boasts the largest number of factions at launch compared to the first 2 games, which is great for variety, especially if you have none of those aforementioned pre-existing biases against any one of them. Kislev introduces an Eastern European flair with the option to use 3 different legendary lords, each with their own starting positions, and one of whom is actually unlocked through an achievement, which is kinda neat. You have to actually do something in-game to get access to this 3rd legendary lord. They've got a pretty balanced roster with a little bit of everything, and they probably have some of the coolest human units across all 3 titles. I've loved the Streltsy since we first saw them with their axe guns, just absolutely ridiculous and still somehow somewhat grounded. And let's not forget the war sleds being dragged around by these bears. I mean, this is awesome. There's no other way to put it. They're an all-around fun faction. Their unique battlefield mechanic is a little flat, to be perfectly honest. We've seen much more interesting stuff in the last 2 games in their DLC, and there is significantly more interesting stuff in this game itself, too. By comparison, Kislev's unique battlefield mechanic is, yes, I mean powerful, but all in all, a little boring, very passive, quite literally. Grand Cathay, if the name doesn't give it away, brings a Chinese allegory into the universe with 2 legendary lord options, both with their own starting positions and opening challenges. Here again, we have a pretty varied roster, featuring everything from crossbows and rifles to ox-drawn artillery pieces, a magic chariot that can summon celestial lightning and comets, infantry that covers all your bases, flying war machines, and a walking, halberd-swinging statue made of terracotta. Very resilient fantasy terracotta, of course. The unique battlefield mechanic here is probably the best of the bunch, where your ranged units and melee units perform better when they're in close proximity to each other. At times, this will force you to take some risks in order to come out on top, and it's one of the few active unique battlefield mechanics that needs you to actually apply yourself rather than simply happening automatically in the background. The 4 factions dedicated to the Chaos Gods each have their own flavor as well. Khorne is the god of war, rage, blood, etc., etc. Nurgle, the god of pestilence and disease. Tzeentch, the god of change, and Slaanesh, the god of excess. Each of these have just one legendary lord, starting across the northern expanse of the map, and each have their own rosters with minimal and entirely acceptable overlaps at times. For example, they all have their own version of the low-tier Furies, and they also all have their own variants of the higher-tier Soul Grinders, each looking unique enough and working in completely different ways too. Demonic units act much like undead units in that they never break and rout, but if their morale drops low enough, they start to crumble and disintegrate, just using different words, and this is shared across all of these demonic factions when they have demonic units. Some of them have mortal units that don't share these mechanics, and that does set some of them apart. Overall, though, the factions are built very different. Khorne is all about brute force, with only some artillery pieces for range, but not an archer in his roster, and certainly no spellcasters. Some of his units perform better when they've got some kills to their name, and they are all quite hilly. Nurgle's roster is slow as all hell, which isn't my personal favorite flavor. It's not my style, it's not my preference, especially because his units largely need to engage in melee. There's very little ranged support here, but there is a variety of monsters, both big and small, and in the air and not. But again, like I said, playing him has just sadly not been for me. And it's unfortunate because he has some of the coolest campaign mechanics, and his lore and everything is great. Like, I love him in universe, and even his lore of magic in the game has some very good variety of spell types and everything, but again, that slow pace just didn't work for me. But if you enjoy it, then you'll like him very, very much. His battlefield unique, though, is kind of bland. Just giving some units a melee defense buff when they engage in melee? That's nothing special. The Slaaneshi roster lacks any range whatsoever, and no airborne units either here, focusing on fast-moving troops on the ground between chariots, cavalry, and infantry that's so fast it may as well be cavalry. Some of them perform especially well as flankers, some perform better when enemy units near them are losing morale, and some apply new debuffs to their targets. The lore of magic, once more, is nicely varied and has my second favorite set of visuals. Tzeentch is the magic god, which is why his lore of magic has the coolest visuals, I think, across all the lores of magics. There's all sorts of vortices and breath spells and magic missiles and just tons of cool stuff in general. His roster itself feels a little strangely mediocre though. The reliance on ranged units is perfectly fine, though I don't care for the excuses being made about pink horrors not splitting into blue horrors. These guys are game developers, they've had almost 5 years, they knew this unit was coming eventually, surely they could have figured something out, but that's a tiny nitpick in the grand scheme of things. The roster is visually very stylish, though at the cost of some frames per second, but it is also the smallest of the lot, and there aren't even the simple variants that could have easily fluffed the roster up a bit. Like, we get a unit of Chaos Knights. Why not throw in a unit with halberds to give us anti-large and armor piercing on more than just one unit in the entire roster? At least the unique battlefield mechanic is cool. Adding a barrier on top of the health bar, Tzeentch units take no damage until that barrier has been broken, and if you're able to manage your units well enough, that barrier will recharge on the battlefield, potentially keeping even the weakest of units alive for much longer than one might expect. Then, finally, there is the Demons of Chaos faction, a truly fresh experience as far as Total War games are concerned on the campaign map, which we'll touch on in a bit. On the battlefield, the units are a blend of the other 4 Chaos Gods, and the unique faction mechanic involves fighting with your legendary lord and causing damage until a bar fills up, giving you a random special ability from one of the 4 gods to use as and when you see fit. Again, one of the more interesting ones, because at least it involves you making active decisions as a player. Truth be told, the rosters overall feel a bit smaller than they perhaps should be at launch. It becomes all too easy to compare these small rosters to the fully fleshed out rosters of prior games, but even when any single roster is compared to a single DLC faction from the prior games, you can quite easily see the disparity. Now, obviously, things are being held back for release later in DLC packs. Some will be perfectly fine with the smaller rosters across more factions, while some will have hoped for more fleshed out rosters after waiting for nearly 5 years, especially when you consider that one entire faction is basically just a mix-up of 4 others. Tzeentch again especially stands out. As I said earlier, a few variants can't be too hard to throw in there. Add a few more mortal units perhaps? There are, relatively speaking, easy, in air quotes, solutions to this problem, but the most profitable solution is to save these units for DLC packs over the next 5 or so years of post-release support. On which note, faction campaign mechanics. The campaign mechanics across the factions range from some of the most innovative stuff we've seen in a Total War game in ages, to a strange distribution of mechanics that should exist across the board. And look, I know, Creative Assembly's been doing this for Total War games for quite some time now, where they take faction mechanics that should apply across the board, but give them to individual factions so that they feel different from each other. It's been the case for quite some time now, but again, one of the most dangerous phrases in the English language is, "we've always done it that way," and Creative Assembly needs to stop doing it that way, because some of these mechanics are compelling, but they should apply across the board, and then the factions should be getting different, unique mechanics that are truly unique, and I'll give you some examples from in the game itself. With all this said, do keep in mind that these are still the most fleshed out launch faction mechanics we've probably seen across the 3 games, but again, that's not without its caveats. Let's start with the good stuff though. I like to start with the good stuff. The Demons of Chaos have a whole slew of mechanics centered around the idea of not being able to decide between 4 lovers. You'll do things in their name, like make a few sacrifices or conquer a city, and in return they'll give you gifts. Some of these gifts will unlock new faction mechanics that are slight variations on the other demon faction mechanics, while other gifts involve body parts or weapons that you can pick and choose to build your own legendary lord. Each part has its own pros and cons, and the novelty does eventually wear off as the decisions stop really mattering all that much and it becomes more of a chore, but eventually you have to choose between the gods or remaining undivided, and that will lock away some of your choices while opening up others. Even though, again, like I said, the novelty kind of wears off at some point, this is special, this is fresh, this is new, it is completely different, and it's fun to play with, even if at the end of the day, the numbers don't matter all that much because you play so well that it's irrelevant. There is fun to be had here. There are toys to play with, there are modifiers to look at, there are things to discover and explore, and then making your own kind of like, Build-A-Bear Legendary Lord is fun. There's no other way to put it. Your Legendary Lord skill tree is also interesting in that way because it determines how you progress through this love pentagon, if you will, and your progress with any of these gods will also determine what units you'll be able to recruit. It's a very different approach to things, though it does raise some questions that we'll touch on later in this video. Got to keep things organized, but again, it's completely different from almost anything we've seen before. It ties in nicely with the themes of the faction. On that note, Nurgle's campaign mechanics are probably actually even more cool than being able to stitch together your own faction. His setup is, again, absolutely unique and makes sense in ways that you could not justify for another faction unless they shared very specific themes. See, this is how you make unique faction mechanics. Everything you know about developing your cities from other factions is thrown out the window as you instead deal with this slow process of growth and decay. Nurgle is the god of such things, and so it makes sense that his faction is influenced by such things, and it is so beautiful. Sure, some things follow the usual rules of city management, like managing your settlement's overall level, and some buildings still follow the traditional format, but most are in this automated life cycle where you only pay for the lowest tier, though you pay a significant amount of money, and then you just wait as the building automatically tiers up, unlocking higher and higher levels of benefits, adding units to your recruitment pool, and then eventually these buildings go from their highest level to their lowest and start the cycle all over again. Your economy grows and collapses, your growth rates grow and collapse, your rates of corruption grow and collapse, and you can certainly plan around the whims of growth and decay, but it's completely different than your usual city planning, and like I said, thematically appropriate and specific. Even unit recruitment works differently, where these buildings will add to a global recruitment pool of sorts as they go through their levels of growth, and then you can instantly acquire those units at any time for any army, though they need to grow in strength over time after they arrive. Nurgle's other major unique mechanic is plagues. Fun, but not particularly special, to be quite frank. Most of these are fairly useless symptoms outside of extremely rare use case scenarios, and so you'll be going back to the same 2 or 3 to either cause attrition or help spread corruption. It's a cool idea, but it just doesn't do enough, and really it just shows how lacking the Skaven were in this department more than anything else. It's also hell to be on the receiving end of these plagues as a player. Cathay is up next. Still interesting, but a bit more plain as you try to balance yin and yang. Much like units on the battlefield work best when yin and yang units are working in harmony, the faction as a whole works best when balance and harmony are maintained. In order to do this, you recruit generals of either leaning, research tech of either leaning, or build buildings of either leaning. It's fine. Not particularly compelling, as you're basically just trying to balance a number line, pretty much. And then there's also the caravan mechanic, where you can recruit caravan leaders and tell them where to go and the value of goods they should carry, and eventually they'll get there after a few events or maybe a battle, and then you get paid and maybe a reward item. It's a very simple mechanic, and it misses the mark in many ways. For one, trade caravans aren't really unique to Cathay. I understand the whole Silk Road, Ivory Road parallel they're drawing, but in the form it exists in-game, sending caravans through treacherous territory could apply to almost any faction that participates in trade. It's not like other factions trade through teleportation, they're also sending caravans, right? What's more, the fact that the value of these caravans doesn't tie into resources in any way is just another missed opportunity. The resources you actually have access to versus the resources that the recipient faction may or may not desire could result in an interesting dynamic, fluctuating, prices, making some resources worth chasing on the campaign map, really changing how you approach campaign gameplay. But it doesn't do any of that. You just invest some money and send them on their merry way. And I understand that it's an abstraction, but here you have an opportunity to make a more compelling mechanic, and instead, it's as simple as it could be, pretty much. Heck, destroying an enemy caravan doesn't even give you anything unique. It feels like a very one-dimensional mechanic, meant to be engaged with in a single way for any actual fun, and everything else is just sort of there. Again, this is the Total War fan in me speaking. I understand simplifying some of these things for the fantasy setting because, it makes more sense. Warhammer battles, it's all about going from battle to battle. Whatever, reason you might want to give. But as a Total War fan, I really want to see trade mechanics that go beyond 2 or 3 clicks to make a trade deal through diplomacy. I want to see something more compelling. On the topic of diplomacy, though, most of Tzeentch's mechanics are exactly that. You can control the flow of Winds of Magic too, which can help with spell casting on the battlefield or can help bolster some buildings' abilities, but the bigger mechanic is about using grimoires that you earn through various actions and then spending them to make people do things. It's all very basic subterfuge and skullduggery. Again, something that any faction could do, but in the name of calling it a unique faction mechanic, we have things like open the gates during a siege. It goes beyond that, sure, like tell people to attack other people, or make 2 people fight, or give me your city. Diplomacy and subterfuge are totally Tzeentch's things, but this is the kind of diplomacy and underhanded stuff that humans partake in the real world. Heck, spies unlocking gates for your army has been in previous Total War games too. I'm disappointed in Tzeentch's execution in the game. He's very, sad to say, boring for a god about sorcery and change and evolution and all that cool stuff. Yes, he is my favorite chaos god, and that's why I can see so clearly how underdone he is. And you know what they say about raw chicken. It can be pretty foul. On the topic of foul things, Slaanesh lets you seduce enemy units, and that makes them join you on the battlefield instead. You can also summon supporting armies in areas of high corruption, and you can activate one of 3 modifiers in your cities. Again, nothing particularly flavorful, outside of the flavor text itself. I'm talking about the campaign mechanics here, by the way, to be clear. The voice work, with Slaanesh especially, is exquisite. I say Slaanesh, I mean N'Kari and N'Kari's faction, but I'm just being a bit more generic here in my statements, I suppose. But anyway, my terminology aside, exquisite voice work here. Beautiful stuff. Slaanesh also has some of their buildings' performance tie in with local control levels, which is a step up from just static effects and an interesting idea. But again, I feel like that's something that could apply for all factions. It's a very realistic system that should apply across the board, but again, in the name of making it a unique faction mechanic, it's just been given to Slaanesh, and it's been called unique. Khorne is actually even simpler, but in the case of Khorne, it works out rather brilliantly. See, Khornate armies do better and help the faction as a whole do better as long as they keep fighting. If they stop fighting for too long, they start to hurt the faction overall and themselves. When Khorne's factions defeat a city, they can raise it and freely raise a support army called a blood host. It costs money as far as upkeep is concerned, but the actual, appearance of this army happens for free, and they can grow to be quite strong with the right technology and the right sort of skill tree options and stuff like that. So they're quite powerful tools. And between their appearance and the campaign movement boosts the faction's armies get when raising cities or winning battles, you're encouraged to move fast and hard, burning everything in your sight, only settling one city per province at most, as the raised ruins get automatically occupied by your faction over time. These mechanics, again, while also simple, are much more engaging than, say, Slaanesh's or even Tzeentch's. But enough about faction-specific mechanics. Other campaign mechanics and the narrative campaign. No, that's not a typo, we'll get to it in a bit. Beyond faction-specific campaign mechanics, there are some new mechanics that apply to many factions or across the board. Corruption, for example, now works differently, split amongst the different Chaos gods, Chaos in general, Skaven, and the vampiric sort. They impact each other and their parent factions based on their levels, and particularly high Chaos corruption of a specific god will result in cults dedicated to that god being formed in a region. These cults typically have quite simple options to generate more of a faction-specific resource, though in the case of Khorne and Nurgle, they have particularly interesting options that consume the cult, but either teleport your legendary lord to the cult location, or spread a bunch of plague respectively. These are otherwise simple distractions in the grand scheme of things. The occurrence of cults is just too random to use reliably as a strategy, though when one shows up, you'll have an extra source of resources or perhaps mayhem. High levels of specific god corruption will also make that god ascendant, and when one god is ascendant, they'll have access to more powerful manifestations, for special abilities they can use once every so often to various ends. Quality of life improvements across the board are amazing. The quick deal menu that lets you know what deals may or may not work out, the balance deal button, and even the get out of my territory button are all nice additions. The latter usually doesn't work though, at least in my experience, as the AI just calls your bluff and then you have to declare a war to get them out anyway. And sure, it doesn't hurt your trustworthiness as the button says, but you still get sucked into a potentially pointless and arduous war, or just let the AI have its way. The diplomacy stuff though is quite cool. Being able to establish outposts in allied cities and recruit from their rosters really mixes things up, and I'm glad to see it apply across the board to all factions. Well, all factions that can engage in diplomacy, of course. Now, some of you have rightfully pointed out that this seems to go against the point of asymmetric design, but it's not easy to get these outposts. Making and maintaining allies, performing allied missions to speed up the gain of allegiance points, these aren't quickly or easily done, so you have to put work in to maybe help fill the gaps in your roster. The work needed to do so makes the mechanic justified, in my opinion, because it's not like an easy button click that just completely breaks the asymmetry. There are other quality of life changes too, but those are mainly UI and UX upgrades that are noteworthy, but neither make nor break the game or your immersion. What does make, or perhaps break the game, is the narrative campaign. Oh boy, I wish I could switch it off. Look, it's well written and illustrated and voice acted, and it's a great story, but the mechanics are just arduous. Waiting for rifts to open up so you can teleport to one of 4 realms of the Chaos Gods to waffle about and then fight a 30 to 40 minute battle of attrition is not my idea of a good time. The outlier here is Slaaneish's realm. It is excellent, providing an interesting challenge to you as the player, appealing to you as a player, breaking the 4th wall, and even tempting the likes of me, somebody who doesn't min-max, who focuses on role-playing, tempting me at times with its foul seductions. Every step you take closer to the center presents you with a great reward you can accept at the cost of leaving the realm and not being able to return until the rifts next open. These gifts can be truly hard to deny at times, and the closer you get to the center, the better the gifts get, pushing you to waste time in this realm for that sweet, sweet, juicy reward that's just outside the center of the realm. This realm embodies Slaanesh. It comes out of the screen and grabs you. It's so good. Meanwhile, in Nurgle's realm, you suffer attrition unless you use Encamp stance or arrive at a special location to heal your army. In Khorne's realm, you just fight battles until a bar fills up, and then you fight another battle. Though, at least in Khorne's realm, there are gifts to distract you, powerful weapons that he takes back when you go to a different realm, so gone pretty quickly. Not as enticing as Slaanesh. Oh, and Tzeentch. You teleport from portal to portal until you get to the right portal, and then you fight the big battle. The gifts are all lame, and you feel robbed if you engage with them. Tzeentch has been very disappointing. Also disappointing are the negative effects from hanging out in the Chaos Realms. They really do nothing but slow you down a bit because you can heal them pretty easily. There are no horrendous mutations or corruptions of the flesh and soul. They're just, again, kind of boring. And on that note, let me tell you, those battles of attrition, those survival battles at the sort of center of every realm, I'm glad you can auto-resolve them. The fact that you can auto-resolve these narrative battles tells you even Creative Assembly knows how much of a grind they can be. You don't have to beat them once to unlock the option to auto-resolve them in future campaigns. No, you can do that right from the get-go, from your first campaign. That's the saving grace of the narrative campaign's mechanics here, that you can skip some of their most crucial moments. And look, I've got, again, nothing against the story itself. The story's pretty neat. I think it's quite interesting, and it's amazingly expressed too. Like I was saying, the cutscenes are beautiful. The writing is lovely. The voice acting is top-notch. Such good voice acting. But the way the narrative translates into mechanics leaves much to be desired. And what's saddest is that each of the factions is doing the same thing. Whether you play as Cathay or the Demon Prince, you're going through the same motions with only slightly altered reasons. It's like the Vortex campaign all over again, like nothing was learned from the mistakes in Game 2, going through the same motions, and the game could easily have just not done that. You know how the Tomb Kings in Warhammer 2 DLC don't give a damn about the Vortex? Or the Vampire Coast, or even Malice, or the list goes on. Just do that here. Give us different narratives for each faction from the get-go. Otherwise, it's just a backdrop for more interesting DLC factions to be added in later. Anyway, the survival battles aren't fun enough to do multiple times, and I struggled to muster the desire to do multiple different ones in the same campaign, let alone across different campaigns. Every time the rifts opened, I got this feeling of just let me play the game. That's Siege Rework. Yeah, this gets its own section because it was such a major selling point. The Siege Rework has its pros and cons. The maps themselves are really quite cool. There are multiple paths, there's verticality, there are interesting structures and shapes and visuals. The flow of the maps are really interesting as well, building choke points and introducing spaces where you can place ranged units safely to fire on incoming enemy threats. There's a lot of cool stuff here to look at. Most of the time it works pretty well too, but quite a bit of the time you really see the flaws in the AI and you have to actively not do the strategic thing if you want to challenge. I'm not talking about cheese here, I'm talking about strategic decisions. Spreading your army out to come from all sides will sometimes break the AI. Feigning left then going right will confuse the AI. Splitting your forces up when they were originally marching together will confuse the AI. You can quite easily get behind the AI and then camp on capture points to destroy the towers they invested so much time and money in. With large cities, at least you have to overcome the walls and the AI is able to respond to you a bit better, but once you're past that initial line of defense, it's just mayhem. And the thing is, I think I fought maybe a handful of siege defenses at most, and I had to really bait them. The only time I didn't was when I was defending the Bastion's gate against rock-stupid AI that would throw its weak armies at me, so, that was fun. The vast majority of the rework is built around being the defender, and I very rarely had to defend. I will say though, when I was defending, the AI was a bit better. It laid itself out appropriately, it forced me to move around the map. Granted, again, I had to bait these attacks, so I was typically horribly under-equipped and severely outnumbered, but hey, when attacking cities, the AI is better than when defending. The jury's still out on field battles though. Unfortunately, the tower defense mechanics are a little out of place, even in the fantasy setting of Warhammer. As a defender, I have control of the city, the whole city. Why would I selectively build barricades in a way that leaves gaps? What do you mean I'm low on supplies to build barricades? Tear down that peasant's house and stack the rubble to block an angle of attack. We're trying to save our provincial capital here. We'll pay that peasant back, unless we're Bretonnians. But now I'm thinking like a historical Total War player again, and even those games had these kinds of issues. It's just brought a lot more to the forefront when you're making active decisions during the siege. I can suspend my disbelief when I ran out of time before the siege battle. I can only place so many deployables because the enemy's upon us. I get it. But in the middle of battle, it's strange to limit positioning in that way. But I'm getting lost in the weeds again. The point holding and tower building and supply management doesn't do anything for me and just feels like busy work mid-battle to make it seem like there's tension where there really kinda isn't. It's a sideways approach at solving the siege problem, adding bells and whistles and not really coming out on top. Again, the layouts are awesome, real eye candy, but the new mechanics and the AI's navigation of the new layouts and new mechanics leaves again much to be desired. On which note, there's so much missing. I feel like it bears repeating because it's been like 30 minutes since I mentioned it. If you like the first two games and all the DLC, you'll probably like this one too. In fact, to be clear, I'm enjoying it for what it is myself, but that doesn't mean I haven't noticed its flaws and all that's missing. Remember when we saw duels in Three Kingdoms and almost all collectively thought how great those would be in Warhammer 3? Remember when we saw duels in Troy and thought that was more evidence of such a great feature coming to Warhammer 3? Remember when we saw the unique terrain types on the battlefields of Troy and wondered how that might be used in Warhammer 3? Or when we saw that a hero could have their mount shatter but keep fighting separate from their mount, and thought how that makes sense for some legendary lords in the Warhammer world? Yeah, that was all left behind, like naval battles before them. To be clear, by the way, naval battles are still fought upon a nearby island instead. But hey, why compare a Warhammer game to a non-Warhammer game? Let's look between Warhammer games. Like how units that need more than one building to recruit are just no longer a thing now, apparently somehow further simplifying the empire building aspect of things. Or we could talk about how searching ruins is no longer a thing. I mean, the novelty of those puzzles in the second game was short-lived, but at least there was something. Now it just feels like another system that couldn't be improved, so it was just tossed out. I already mentioned how caravans feel one-dimensional since they provide nothing for an attacker, and there's also again the Ogre Kingdoms lacking any regiments of renown despite being a faction DLC. And let me mention once more, the small rosters, and the fact that you can't visually see things like weapons when you add them to your heroes and lords is more than a little silly, considering it happens at least once in the prologue campaign, and you can completely modify your demon prints. That's a feature that should be implemented to varying degrees across the board. Another major thing that's missing are all the frames the game keeps dropping. I've got an RTX 3090, and I've got an i9 7900X. I shouldn't be seeing frames drop when I zoom in on the battlefield. Whether I'm recording or not, I will get these horrible moments of lag that I just cannot explain or figure out. But hey, optimization is usually the last thing to be tackled. There are also some egregious balancing issues and bugs that we content creators have flagged for a long time but won't be seeing fixed at launch. Units are super sticky, not responding to orders at times, especially the ones that fly, which is so very infuriating to deal with. The pendulum deals an inexplicable amount of damage. Lord effects range from palatable to pointless. Auto-resolve balance is still a mess, and sometimes that'll force you to fight the most inane battles. And if you're not fighting inane battles, you're performing inane tasks, like chasing a goddamn army around your territory for 6 turns before you finally catch them. It's also really telling that you can literally see, interact, and do battle with entire factions from the first game, important factions from the Warhammer universe, but they aren't playable in the base game here. All the models, textures, and everything is already in here, but nope, you're gonna need to spend the other $120 to play them. Plus, actually, because some of them are DLC. It's not unexpected, but still kind of egregious. They're here, they're integral parts of some of these campaigns. How are they not playable? You can literally see all their stats in the game too, like these guys are in the game. You have all the files, minus campaign mechanics and their associated UI perhaps, downloaded onto your computer when you install this game, but it's all just locked behind a paywall? You can't even use them in multiplayer without spending that extra money. The game is also missing some of the style of its predecessor. The UI has had some functional improvements, but it lacks the aesthetic flair of the second game. The beautiful illustrations, the scroll work, just the little touches, the little extras. It just feels like a downgrade. Doesn't break the game, but is certainly a backward step in my books, and I hope they kind of course correct for future Total War games. The tooltips are also sometimes very unclear, like this one for Cathay's Compass, which I completely forgot to talk about when I was talking about campaign mechanics because it's that forgettable a mechanic, where you load up some modifiers but have your decision locked for X number of turns before you can change your mind, so you might as well just keep loading up the modifier, though really it doesn't make much of a difference anyway. Wait, I didn't even talk about Kislev's campaign mechanics. Wow, those are really forgettable. I'm only remembering them now as I'm recording this, not while I was writing my script. I mean, again, they're very roundabout and yet simple mechanics. They don't really do much. They're a number line. Yeah. But as with Cathay's Compass, doesn't really make much of a difference anyway. Like this review for diehard fans of Warhammer and Total War Warhammer. This is the best Warhammer fantasy battle game out there, bar none. There's no denying it. I doubt anybody will be able to compete, not for another decade or two at least. How could they? The visuals here are through the roof, the writing is top-notch, the multiplayer action is vastly improved between 8-player simultaneous co-op, specific mini-campaigns, and a new point-capture-centered battle mode, complete with a supply mechanic and reinforcements like the survival battles, only shorter and significantly more fun. These are some of the most fleshed-out factions we've had at launch for these games, and we're seeing hints at the hinterlands of Koresh, Ind, and Nippon coming soon. Unexplored regions of the Warhammer world, all undeniably exciting stuff. And I want to be extra clear. Again, I enjoyed the game quite a bit. The novelty eventually wore off and the cracks started to show more and more, but I'm still planning on playing a Let's Play or two before the second DLC drops and freshens things up. But my enjoying the game and my reviewing the game are two different things. One can enjoy something despite its flaws, and that's where Total War Warhammer 3 sits in its current state. It didn't get the second delay I thought it was going to, but it really should have. It really, really should have. But there you have it, folks, my full thoughts on Total War Warhammer 3. A long review, I know, but this is the culmination of 6 years of build-up, and I thought the game and you all deserved a deep dive like this. A thorough dissection of the good, the bad, and the ugly. If this review helped you make a decision or you want to simply support the channel while you buy the game, please don't hesitate to use the link in the description and pinned comment down below to do so. If you have any thoughts of your own, feel free to share them down below. I look forward to reading them, but please keep it civil. I know we can all get passionate about the subject at hand. As always, folks, for more strategy gaming content, including news, reviews, previews, let's plays, and more, don't hesitate to subscribe. And as always as well, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.